All right, so we pick back up uh, with the end of Greece, and the Romans conquered the Greeks, but in different than most conquerings, the Romans know that hey, we should sort of absorb them. And there's a lot of Greek civilization, there are Greek cities and towns there on the peninsula of Italy, and so they're using the same artisans, they're using the same skills as the Greeks, and they're highly influenced by the Greeks. I mean, the Romans themselves are very interesting because they're more of like a sponge culture. They didn't really have their true identity yet. They were sort of gleaning that from the people that they conquered. So that's what we see separate that's going on. But what really does make Roman art and something so different than what we'd seen before is that they really get into portraiture, and in fact the style is called Verasic and or Veritism, and this means that when they carved these busts like you're looking here, they are true to the sitter. Before, we didn't have any of that. Even the Greeks themselves, they were not carving portraits. They were doing gods. They were, telling sort of their origins and mythologies. If it was a warrior, it was more of a generic warrior. It didn't have an actual identity. Well, these do. They're highly realistic, and they're always the busts. And it may be weird to walk into some Roman villa and see just head after head after head on a wall, but really this is the earliest form of sort of your family photos, and it's very important for Romans to prove that they are Romans, that they are linked to the true Romans and not just a population that was conquered. So it's kind of like their statement of patriotic ability and the fact that they can sort of be the ruler. So that's what we're looking at here within these busts, and so they'd be kept again and again. Now, Rome, like many other civilizations, of course, gets conquered. But way even before that, we didn't know much about them until we find the site on Pompeii. And I highly recommend, in fact, just do it. You'll see that there's an animation and then a video about Pompeii on your Moodle shell. You'll want to watch those to see sort of what that eruption of Mount Vesuvius was like when all that ash and gas kind of came streaming down the mountain and sort of encased the city of Pompeii. It was actually thought of that it was a legend for the longest time, that kind of like it was maybe a part of the tale of Atlantis or something. But then it was a farmer actually found a Herculaneum, the other city that's near, that's a part of this on the other side of the mountain on that same island. And so when that city was found, I think it was right around the 17th century, all of a sudden we get sort of this revival of Greek and Roman art that happens throughout the world, because now we realize, oh, this is true. But because Rome had been sacked and most of it plundered, we didn't know what things really did look like. But Pompeii was preserved, all the ash and all of that preserved the walls. So here we can see one of the frescoes and what would have been painted on this. And there's several great examples of their pottery and their painting and their lifestyle. So check out those videos because it's really important for why we know what we know about Rome and Roman art. Another piece that was preserved, and I love this, right? It's just this little mosaic, what's called a pebble mosaic. These are little tiny stones, colored stones, sort of intricately put together. And, just to kind of everyday life, right? Things that would have been around there that they're seeing. Of course, for Roman architecture, the biggest one would be the Colosseum. I highly recommend, once again, there's a film on Canopy, and there's another there with the YouTube link if you're really interested in how the Colosseum worked. It could hold over 50,000 people, and it was several layers. We're seeing sort of the ruins here, right? This is all buttressing to sort of help what was left sort of hold up. So it's definitely in a state of ruin, but it would have been larger. It's built on a site which was actually the Emperor Nero's sort of, we'll call it sort of playhouse. He was an interesting emperor in Rome's history. He was very greedy, loved his money, loved building things. And so he purposely built or set Rome afire in this certain neighborhood to level it, so then he could then take the land and build his new palace on it. Well, of course, that didn't sit right, and he was actually eventually even murdered by his own guards. And the next emperor sort of then took all those stones from his palace and remade to make the Colosseum and give it back to the people. So that's why it exists, and has always been sort of the center of that democracy for them, or republic. What's very cool about it, and the films talk about, is that it can be flooded, right? So what we're seeing is below. This would have been the arena floor covered in sand as it works its way across, and this whole thing can be flooded up to this first point, and then they could imitate sea battles and stuff. I mean, it was definitely a place where death happened. It was kind of like a matinee, like open every day sort of thing, where you could catch a matinee or later on, and they had things scheduled set up. So if you wanted to see everything from Christians being mutilated or burned, you could see that at a certain time, and it repeated its schedule every day. And they always saved the actual gladiators towards the end of the day, sort of like the prime time fight. So really interesting structure that still survives. All right, so moving into chapter 15, the link that we have with Rome is how Christianity forms. And as I just mentioned, there's the persecution going on, but it's then a Roman emperor named Constantine who gives the Christians their freedom or religious freedom there, and actually comes from a vision. Constantine is actually taking an army and moving into Italy at the time to sort of take over Rome, because Rome's always kind of getting fractured and stuff like this. So I know it's a long story, but anyway, on his way there to fight other sort of fellow Romans, but from a different empire, Rome, he has this vision in the clouds, supposedly that if he paints a cross on his shield, that he would get victory. He didn't really know what it meant, and as the legend goes, then Jesus actually visits him in a dream that night and says, if you do this, I will let you win. So he does that, and of course then has this sort of conversion to Christianity. And from there, Rome's influence on Christianity can be seen in its first building. When you first get religious freedom, they needed a place to worship, and Rome had several basilica or meeting houses, and these meeting houses were already sort of open, and it offered a great sort of model that, when we look at it, becomes sort of the beginning of our church style. Like, even if you're here in Helena, Montana, and looking at the Helena Cathedral, or you've traveled across Europe and seen the Gothic style cathedrals, or you think of Notre Dame, right? This is the very beginning of it. These are sort of the models that then are built on top of. And so here's actually an image of Constantine himself that we've already talked about, and this would have been a colossal statue that was put in there. This is just the head and the hand, and a part of the foot still remained, but knowing that head right there featured is 8 feet tall, and I've seen this, it's quite amazing, this sort of rubble that is left. The rest of it would have been made by wood, or made out of wood, and sat sort of like as a Zeus-like figure in one of those sort of temples built for him. I shouldn't say temples, but sort of a basilica that's built there and sort of commemorating Constantine and his great efforts. So he does move the capital of Rome to Byzantium, or what we know as Istanbul, but he calls it Constantinople. So we're shifting from Rome all the way into Turkey, or modern day Turkey, and it's really important shift for him, because what happens is that it really sort of like starts the Byzantine style, of representation, and we move kind of, some would say even seemingly backwards. Byzantine art actually held a really negative name for the longest time, because you think of like Greek art and then Roman art, and it's very similar to what the Renaissance will later be inspired from. So all of a sudden, to kind of go into this flattened style again was somewhat problematic, and some refer to this as, the beginning of the Dark Ages and stuff, but it really wasn't. What they focused on are sort of the Christian icons, but they put most of their imagery into frescoes and into mosaics. So what you're looking at here is little glass tiles with gold leaf in the back, creating that entire illumination. So all of this is mosaic that you're seeing there. And the Byzantine time, it doesn't last as long because there's a lot of warring going back and forth. And if you watch the Canopy film that is listed on your Moodle shelf for Christian art and Byzantine art, you'll get more into those reasonings. But to get into those Middle Ages and sort of the fall of Rome, what we're seeing is Rome being fragmented into sort of like territorial tribes, and will eventually form the countries that we think of today as far as Germany or France or England. And because the Roman Empire is now finished in its totality, there's still sections of it that remain, right? They're right around Constantinople and stuff. But these tribes are sort of they've been under Roman control forever. Now they're set free, and they have this knowledge, they have the understanding of sort of how to be united, building structures, all that. Rome's extensive highways, building that they put everywhere, right? So it kind of helps all these other soon to be civilizations rise up. And one of the earliest pieces that we see is left in the burial ship of Sutton Hoo, and pretty interesting. Please watch the YouTube video. It actually has the real documentation of the site itself. And there were 3 ships that were buried and preserved. And these are in England, and from what we know is sort of the Saxons. And it's really interesting because usually sites are sort of vandalized, and what they found was 3 ships that had been ceremonial buried in the ground, and in there was still the preserved remains of all these artifacts. So this would be the lid to a purse. And I mean, you just look at sort of the ornamentation, and you could see sort of like the Celtic sort of knotting and things that are going on here. But there's a lot of different things stylistically happening. Even sort of these anthropomorphic looking creatures, dogs and what looks like a man and such. So pretty beautiful stuff. And inside there, we have this nice belt buckle. We have a lot of things that actually sort of give us a greater idea that this is not the Dark Ages. This is not a time where we are going back in our intellect. We're, still adding to that, but it's, each civilization is truly just kind of being built up. So take a look at those videos, and I'm going to show you just one more. So here's even more artifacts that came from there. You can find this coinage that shows that they had contact all over, that trade was happening. Each of these are from different sort of eras. I'll end here, but what we're now transitioning into is that as these countries are forming, they're taking those Roman basilica models. They're going to start to really make their own, and France gets ahead of the game and creates what we know then as the Gothic style. So we're going to come back with this next part to talk specifically about the formation of Gothic cathedrals and what that looked like.